I stood quietly by the frost-covered window of my secluded Vermont cabin while watching the luxury SUV belonging to my older sister Sarah slowly disappear behind the long winding slope of the driveway. My name is Jennifer. I am 38 years old and I had just agreed to look after my 10-year-old nephew Toby so that my sister could take our aging parents on a much-needed anniversary cruise. Toby sat on the worn velvet sofa in the living room, as he usually did, rocking his body rhythmically back and forth while staring into a void that no one else could see. My family had spent a decade believing he was trapped in a world of silence due to severe nonverbal autism, and every time I looked into his deep brown eyes, my heart broke for the boy who had never uttered a single word since the day he was born. The humid August heat began to press against the glass, so I turned toward the kitchen to find the pitcher of fresh orange juice that my sister had meticulously prepared for me before her departure. I reached into the refrigerator and pulled out the chilled glass container, feeling the condensation slick against my palms as I poured the bright liquid into a tall glass. Just as I raised the rim to my lips to take a refreshing sip, a sound pierced the silence of the house that made the blood freeze in my very veins. "Auntie, please do not drink that juice because my mom already prepared it specifically for you," a voice whispered with chilling, perfect articulation. I stood paralyzed with the glass inches from my mouth, slowly turning to find Toby standing in the doorway with an intense, sharp intelligence in his eyes that I had never witnessed before. Before I reveal the terrifying secrets that my nephew began to share with me that afternoon, I want to invite you to join our community. If this family mystery is gripping you, please subscribe to the channel and leave a like to support our storytelling. Tell me in the comments which city you are watching from today, and now, let us continue with the shocking truth. The silence enveloping the small kitchen became so heavy that I could literally hear the frantic thumping of my heart against my ribs after that glass nearly slipped from my trembling fingers. I stared at Toby while struggling to process the fact that the boy who had been silent for a decade was now standing before me with a gaze that held the wisdom of an adult. He reached out his small hand to steady my arm, his touch feeling surprisingly firm for a child whom everyone considered fragile and disconnected from reality. "Auntie Jennifer, please do not look at me with such shock, because we do not have much time before they might check on us," he whispered while his voice remained steady despite the tears beginning to well up in his dark eyes. He began to explain that Sarah had spent the last 2 years systematically terrorizing him into absolute silence by promising that he would simply disappear forever if he ever made a single sound. My sister had convinced this poor child that she had the power to make people vanish into thin air just like she had supposedly done with others who got in her way. Toby gripped my sleeve tighter as he added, "She told me that if I spoke even one word, she would send me to a place where no one would ever find me again." I set the glass down on the counter with a shaky hand and leaned closer to inspect the bright orange liquid under the overhead fluorescent light. A fine layer of white powder was settled at the very bottom of the glass, shimmering ominously like crushed diamonds that had refused to dissolve into the citrus juice. My mind immediately raced through the various medications Sarah kept in her cabinet, eventually landing on the heavy sedatives she claimed to take for her frequent bouts of anxiety. This was not just a simple mistake or a stray bit of pulp, but a calculated dose meant to put me into a deep, perhaps irreversible sleep while she was away. Toby watched my realization with a somber expression before pulling me toward the shadows of the hallway, where we could not be seen through the kitchen window. He started describing the countless nights he had spent huddled behind his bedroom door, listening to Sarah whispering in the dark with my family lawyer, Julian Vance. Julian was a man my parents had trusted for decades to handle their estate, yet Toby heard him discussing the specific percentages of the inheritance they would claim once the obstacles were removed. Julian said that the house in Vermont was the biggest prize and they just needed the old man to sign a few more papers. Toby revealed with a chilling calmness that made my skin crawl. They spoke about my parents as if they were already gone, laughing about how easy it was to manipulate the elderly with a few well-placed suggestions and a constant supply of special vitamins. My stomach churned as Toby detailed how Sarah and Julian frequently debated the best way to bypass the legal protections my father had set up to ensure the family cabin stayed in my name. A wave of sickening clarity washed over me as I remembered the mysterious, lingering headaches that had plagued both Mom and Dad for the past several months. Sarah was always the one providing them with herbal teas and supplements, claiming they were essential for their cognitive health, while she secretly drained their life force. Every time they complained of feeling dizzy or confused, Sarah would simply smile her perfect rehearsed smile and tell them to trust her because she only wanted what was best for them. I sank into a kitchen chair as my legs finally gave out, but Toby did not stop his harrowing tale because he needed me to understand the true extent of the danger we were in. He nervously tugged at the hem of his long-sleeved shirt before slowly pulling it up to reveal a constellation of dark yellowish bruises blossoming across his ribs and upper arms. My breath caught in my throat at the sight of such calculated cruelty inflicted on a child by his own mother simply to ensure his compliance. These marks were the silent evidence of the physical toll his forced silence had taken, proving that Sarah was capable of far more than just financial deception. Toby looked down at his bruised skin and whispered, "Every time I made a sound in my sleep, she would come into my room to remind me what happens to noisy children." Toby explained that Julian often visited the house when my parents were asleep, bringing legal documents that he forced Dad to sign while he was in a state of drug-induced confusion. They were planning to move Mom and Dad into a private facility far from Vermont under the guise of specialized medical care, effectively isolating them from anyone who could protect them. Sarah had even joked about how I would be too incapacitated by my own health issues to intervene, suggesting that my recent fatigue was also part of her grand design. I looked at the small brave boy standing in front of me and realized that he had been the only witness to a slow-motion murder plot unfolding right under our noses. The next morning, as the first rays of sunlight filtered through the dense leaves of the Vermont woods, I sat before my old computer and began searching for the contact information of Mark, my former brother-in-law, who had been cast out of our family by Sarah years ago. My hands were trembling as I dialed the number Toby had provided from his hidden stash of memories, wondering if this man would even be willing to speak to a member of the family that had abandoned him so cruelly. After several rings, a weary and guarded voice answered the call, belonging to a man who sounded like he had been living in a perpetual state of defeat since his world collapsed. I quickly identified myself and explained that I was currently with Toby, which seemed to shatter the icy wall Mark had built around his heart during his long, lonely exile. "Jennifer, you must believe me when I say that Sarah is no longer the sister you once knew, because she has become a demon hiding behind a perfect angel's mask," Mark whispered with a mixture of relief and lingering bitterness. He began to recount the harrowing details of how Sarah had meticulously fabricated evidence of domestic abuse against him, using her manipulative charms and Julian's legal expertise to ensure he was stripped of every right as a father. Mark revealed that Sarah had developed a dark, hidden addiction to high-stakes gambling that had spiraled out of control, leading her to owe a dangerous underground casino a staggering $500,000. This massive debt explained her desperate hurry to liquidate the estate of Mom and Dad, as the people she owed money to were not known for their patience or mercy toward those who failed to pay. Later that afternoon, Toby and I drove to the sprawling suburban mansion belonging to Sarah while she was busy pretending to be a devoted daughter on a cruise ship hundreds of miles away. Using a spare key that Toby had cleverly hidden under a loose stone in the garden months ago, we slipped inside the silent house that smelled of expensive perfume and deceptive calm. We bypassed the grand living room and headed straight for the private office where Sarah kept her most sensitive documents locked away from any prying eyes. Toby pointed to a heavy oak desk with a hidden compartment, which was a secret he had discovered while hiding under the furniture during one of his mother's many explosive temper tantrums. I pried open the compartment and found a thick leather folder containing a version of my parents' will that had been signed only 3 weeks ago. My heart sank as I read the elegant script, realizing that Julian had officially notarized a document that completely removed my name from the inheritance and granted Sarah full control over every asset. There were also several life insurance policies taken out in the names of Mom and Dad, with Sarah listed as the sole beneficiary in the event of their sudden accidental death. I realized with a jolt of pure terror that the cruise was not a celebration of an anniversary, but a carefully planned stage for a tragedy that would leave Sarah as the wealthy survivor of a grieving family. Toby tugged at my hand and pointed to a series of bank statements showing that Sarah had been forging Dad's signature to withdraw thousands of dollars from his retirement fund every single month. We also found a stack of forged medical reports created by Julian, which claimed that Mom was suffering from advanced dementia to justify Sarah taking over as her legal guardian. It became clear that they had been gaslighting my parents for years, making them believe they were losing their minds so they would stop questioning where their money was going. I quickly used my phone to photograph every single document, knowing that these images were the only weapons we had to destroy the life Sarah had built on a foundation of lies. That evening, my phone vibrated incessantly against the wooden surface of the dining table while displaying Sarah's international number, and I had to take a deep, steadying breath to keep my voice calm. I glanced at Toby, who was sitting perfectly still with a look of intense concentration, before I finally swiped the screen to answer the call. Sarah's voice came through with a chirpy, forced enthusiasm that made my skin crawl, because I knew the malice hiding behind her cheerful facade. She spent the first few minutes describing the beautiful sunset over the ocean, but her tone shifted subtly as she began to ask probing questions about how I was feeling. "I hope you have been drinking that fresh orange juice regularly, Jennifer, because it is packed with vitamins that are very good for your health right now," she said with a disturbing level of insistence. I leaned back in my chair and lowered my voice while pretending to sound sluggish and disoriented to satisfy her twisted expectations. I told her that I had been feeling strangely lightheaded and exhausted since she left, even admitting that I had spent most of the afternoon resting on the sofa. Sarah let out a soft, satisfied hum that confirmed my worst fears about the sedatives she had meticulously laced into that pitcher. She then mentioned that Mom and Dad were feeling quite tired and were already sleeping in their cabin, which felt like a veiled warning about their current state of vulnerability. Once the call ended, Toby immediately reached into his backpack and pulled out a sleek silver tablet that Sarah usually kept locked inside her bedside drawer. He tapped a complex numerical sequence into the screen with practiced ease, explaining that he had memorized the code by watching his mother's reflection in the hallway mirror. We spent the next hour scrolling through a series of encrypted messages between Sarah and Julian that laid out their entire plan with sickening precision. Julian had sent several urgent emails regarding the illegal listing of our parents' colonial mansion on an exclusive real estate market for high-end buyers. They were discussing a private sale to an offshore investment group that would bypass the standard waiting periods and public disclosures. The messages revealed that Sarah had already pocketed a massive non-refundable deposit to cover a significant portion of her mounting gambling debts at the casino. Julian had assured her that the paperwork for the house was finalized, and he was simply waiting for the news of a medical emergency to activate the final clauses of the will. I felt a surge of cold fury as I read their jokes about how Mom and Dad would soon be enjoying a very long, undisturbed sleep in a specialized care facility. They had even coordinated the exact time when Sarah would call the local authorities to report my sudden health crisis once she returned to Vermont. Toby pointed to a hidden folder containing digital copies of land deeds that had been altered to show Sarah as the sole owner of the family property. It was clear that they were not just waiting for my parents to pass away, but were actively dismantling their entire life while they were still breathing. I realized that Sarah had been planning this betrayal for years, slowly isolating our family until she was the only one holding the keys to our father's hard-earned fortune. We spent the rest of the night carefully downloading every message and document onto a secure drive, knowing that this evidence was the only thing standing between us and total ruin. The next morning, while the heavy dew still clung to the grass like a shroud, I accidentally discovered an old tin box hidden deep beneath Toby's bed. The box was tucked inside a tattered teddy bear that had been surgically opened and crudely resealed with safety pins to create a secret pocket. Inside the cold metal container, I found several small amber vials without any official labels, containing a cloudy liquid that matched the description of the sedatives used to keep a child in a state of constant mental fog. Toby sat beside me on the floor and explained that Sarah forced him to swallow these drops every single morning under the threat of being sent away to a cold, dark institution. This was how she maintained the illusion of his severe autism, effectively ensuring he remained a silent observer who could never testify against her cruel machinations. A few hours later, Mark arrived at my cabin with a heavy briefcase containing a mountain of financial evidence he had spent the last 24 hours gathering from his private contacts. He laid out dozens of bank statements on the kitchen table that provided a clear trail of Sarah systematically transferring hundreds of thousands of dollars into offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. These transactions were often disguised as charitable donations or medical expenses for Toby's specialized therapies that never actually took place in reality. Mark pointed to a specific document from a decade ago that made my heart stop because it was a detailed mechanical report on the car accident that killed our older brother. The report suggested that the brake lines had been intentionally compromised and the insurance payout had been handled exclusively by Julian Vance, who ensured that Sarah received the lion's share of the settlement. I felt a massive wave of nausea washing over me as the puzzle pieces of our family's tragedies began to lock into place with terrifying precision. Sarah had not just been a greedy sister, but a calculated predator who had been thinning out our family tree for years to consolidate the massive inheritance for herself. Toby watched us with a haunting intensity before he began to describe the scene he had witnessed just hours before my parents left for their anniversary trip. He recounted how Sarah had stood in the kitchen with a strange clinical detachment while brewing a special batch of herbal tea for Mom and Dad. She had pulled a small glass bottle from her pocket and carefully measured several drops of a clear fluid into their favorite ceramic mugs while humming a cheerful tune to herself. Toby's voice trembled with a mixture of grief and courage as he looked me directly in the eyes to deliver the most devastating revelation of the entire morning. "I saw Mom doing that, Auntie Jennifer, and she told me that if I ever opened my mouth, you would also go to sleep forever, just like our oldest brother did," he whispered, while clutching his small hands together so tightly that his knuckles turned white. My parents were currently on a ship in the middle of the ocean, unknowingly consuming the very substances that were designed to make their eventual deaths look like a tragic age-related accident. Sarah had used my brother's death as a blueprint for her current plan, believing that lightning could strike the same family twice without raising any suspicion from the authorities. Mark slammed his fist against the table in a rare display of raw anger while swearing that he would not let her get away with destroying another life. We spent the remainder of the morning organizing the medical vials, the bank transfers, and Toby's recorded testimony into a comprehensive digital file to present to the local police. Every minute that passed felt like an hour as I imagined my parents sitting on that luxury liner, trusting the daughter who was actively counting down the days until their demise. I realized that Sarah had never loved any of us, seeing her own flesh and blood merely as obstacles standing between her and a life of unearned luxury funded by our father's hard work. We were no longer just looking for the truth, but were now engaged in a desperate race to save Mom and Dad before the final dose was administered during their journey home. That weekend, the low rumble of an SUV engine echoed from the top of the driveway to signal that Sarah had finally brought our parents back. But this time I was standing in the foyer completely ready to receive them. I watched through the sidelight as Sarah climbed out of the vehicle with her usual practiced grace, wearing a wide smile that she likely thought was convincing enough to hide the darkness in her heart. The front door swung open and she began to gush about the trip while stepping inside, but her expression instantly twisted into a mask of pure horror when she saw me standing there with Mark at my side. She stumbled backward against the doorframe as her face drained of all color, her eyes darting frantically between me and the man she thought she had successfully erased from our family history forever. I did not give her a single second to regain her composure before I stepped forward and threw the thick folder of evidence onto the mahogany entryway table. Sarah, your little vacation is over because we know exactly what you have been putting in our parents' tea and exactly why you forged these documents with Julian, I stated with a coldness that seemed to vibrate through the air. Mark remained silent but stood like a solid wall of judgment, holding his phone up to show the recorded transactions of her offshore accounts and the gambling debts she had tried to hide. Sarah tried to stammer a pathetic excuse about how we were overreacting to simple vitamins, but her voice trailed off as she realized that her secrets were no longer hidden in the shadows of her bedside drawer. Mom and Dad walked into the house looking fragile and confused, their movements sluggish as they tried to understand why their two daughters were locked in such a vicious confrontation. Before Sarah could poison their minds with another elaborate lie, Toby stepped out from behind the staircase and looked directly at his mother, with a level of courage that made my heart swell with pride. The boy who had been forced into a decade of silence took a deep breath and pointed a steady finger at the woman who had spent years systematically breaking his spirit. You cannot make me stay quiet forever anymore, because you are the one who deserves to be punished for everything you have done to this family, he declared with a voice that was crystal clear and filled with the raw emotion of a child finally claiming his freedom. The shock of hearing Toby speak for the first time in their memory caused Mom to gasp and lean against the wall for support, while Dad stared at his grandson as if he were seeing a ghost. Sarah let out a strangled cry of rage and lunged toward the office to destroy the original files she kept there, but she was met at the door by two local police officers who had been waiting in the kitchen. Julian Vance was also apprehended at the same moment near the back entrance where he had been trying to slip away with a briefcase full of incriminating property deeds and forged medical records. Sarah began to scream that we were all conspiring against her, her perfect hair falling into her eyes as the officers clicked the silver handcuffs around her trembling wrists. I watched with a mixture of immense relief and profound sadness as the sister I once loved was escorted toward the waiting patrol car in front of our childhood home. The neighbors began to peer through their curtains at the spectacle of the wealthy Sarah being led away in disgrace, her screams of protest eventually muffled by the closing of the car door. Mark finally walked over to Toby and pulled him into a long overdue embrace, while I gathered my parents to explain the terrifying truth they had been living through without their knowledge. The mask that Sarah had worn for so long had not just fallen, but had been completely shattered, leaving behind nothing but the wreckage of the lives she had nearly managed to destroy for the sake of a casino debt. 1 month after the horrifying truth was finally brought to light, I stood silently on the sidewalk watching the old colonial mansion being prepared for sale, while feeling as though a dark chapter of my life was finally closing. The legal proceedings had moved with surprising speed because the evidence we provided was so overwhelming that the defense had almost no room to negotiate. Sarah was eventually sentenced to 15 years in a high-security federal prison after being convicted of attempted murder, child endangerment, and massive financial fraud against our parents. Julian was not far behind her as he received a 10-year sentence and was permanently disbarred for his role in forging the trust documents and facilitating the theft of family assets. I sat in that courtroom every single day to look my sister in the eye, yet she never showed a shred of remorse, or even acknowledged the trauma she had inflicted upon her own son. Since the day the handcuffs were placed on her wrists, I have made the conscious decision to sever every possible tie that once bound us together as siblings. Sarah has tried to send multiple letters from her cell and has requested several visitations, but I have instructed my legal team to return every envelope unopened and block her name from our contact lists. The betrayal was far too deep for any words to mend, and I realized that protecting Toby meant ensuring that his mother could never manipulate him with her poison ever again. When a reporter recently asked if I would ever consider a reconciliation for the sake of family unity, I simply shook my head and looked them directly in the eyes with absolute certainty. I no longer have a sister named Sarah, because the woman sitting in that prison cell is merely a stranger with the heart of a demon, I replied with a voice that did not tremble. Back at the cabin in Vermont, Mom and Dad have begun the slow and painful process of recovering their health after months of being unknowingly sedated by their own daughter. They spent the first few weeks in a state of deep shock and grief, struggling to accept that the child they had nurtured had been actively plotting their demise for the sake of gambling debts. However, with the constant support of medical professionals and the joy of seeing their grandson finally thrive, they have started to regain their cognitive clarity and physical strength. They recently held a private meeting with me to officially hand over the management of the family trust fund, trusting me to ensure that the remaining assets are used to secure Toby's future. It was a somber but necessary transition that signaled their renewed trust in the daughter who had fought so hard to save their lives. Perhaps the most heartening part of this entire ordeal has been watching Mark finally reclaim his dignity and the rightful place in his son's life that he should have had all along. The court officially cleared his name of all the fabricated abuse charges after Julian's private files revealed the systematic framing Sarah had orchestrated during their divorce. Mark has moved into a small house just a few miles from my cabin so that he can spend every afternoon with Toby while they slowly rebuild the father-son bond that was stolen from them. I watch them from the kitchen window as they work together on old cars or play catch in the yard, seeing the light return to Toby's eyes with every passing day. This version of our family is smaller and broken in many ways, yet it is built on a foundation of absolute truth and a shared commitment to never let the darkness return. 6 months after that shocking scandal, I sat in the bleachers of a new school where Toby was confidently giving a presentation about his dream of becoming a doctor. Watching him stand behind the mahogany podium with his shoulders square and his voice resonating through the auditorium was a miracle that I once thought would never happen in my lifetime. The boy, who had been forced into a decade of suffocating silence, was now a vibrant, articulate young student who possessed a level of maturity that far exceeded his peers. He spoke about the importance of resilience and the power of finding one's voice, never explicitly mentioning the darkness he had survived, but letting his newfound strength tell the story. Mark sat right beside me with a look of pure, unadulterated pride on his face, while holding my hand as we witnessed the rebirth of the son he had nearly lost forever. I looked back at the long and treacherous journey we had taken to protect our family and felt a profound sense of peace, knowing that justice had finally been served. The legal battle had been exhausting, yet every hour spent in depositions and court hearings was worth it to see Toby finally breathing the air of freedom. Sarah's influence over our lives had vanished like a bad dream, leaving behind a space that we had filled with genuine laughter and the kind of trust that does not require constant monitoring. My parents had moved into a comfortable, sunlit cottage on my property in Vermont, where they spent their mornings gardening and their afternoons playing chess with their grandson. The constant fog of confusion that had once clouded their minds had completely lifted, replaced by a sharp alertness and a deep gratitude for the truth that had saved their lives. As the sun began to set behind the rolling hills, our small but resilient family gathered around the large oak table in my dining room for a peaceful Sunday dinner. There were no hushed whispers in the hallway, no secret vials hidden in the pantry, and no lingering sense of dread about what the next morning might bring to our doorstep. We talked about Toby's upcoming soccer match and Mom's prize-winning roses while sharing a meal that was seasoned only with love and the comfort of our shared reality. Mark shared stories from his youth while Dad listened with a genuine smile, officially welcoming his former son-in-law back into the fold with a respect that had been absent for too long. I realized that while Sarah had tried to destroy us for the sake of a gambling debt, she had unintentionally forged a bond between us that was stronger than anything we had known before. This journey has taught me that the most dangerous predators are often the ones who share our own blood because they know exactly where our hearts are most vulnerable. We must learn to trust our instincts when something feels wrong, even if the person causing the unease is someone we have loved since childhood. Greed is a poison that can rot the strongest family tree from the inside out, turning siblings into strangers and parents into targets for calculated exploitation. Vigilance and the courage to speak the truth are the only shields we have against those who would trade the lives of their kin for a fleeting moment of luxury. Always remember that a family built on lies is a house made of sand, but a family united by the truth can weather even the most devastating storms. Thank you so much for joining me on this emotional and intense journey through the secrets and betrayals of my family's past. If this story touched your heart or reminded you of the power of truth, please share your thoughts and perspectives in the comments below regarding the importance of family trust. Your support means everything to our community, so please do not forget to subscribe and share this video with those who might need a reminder to stay brave. We truly appreciate your time and look forward to seeing you again in our next story, where the light of truth always finds its way through the darkness.